So I did want to go through a couple of year-end agenda items, even though I sort of find myself pedantically rejecting year-end lists and reminiscences sort of on principle. And when I say pedantically, it's because I have this hang up over the month of December being entirely excluded from the year-end list that people make. So if something happens that's noteworthy in like the second half of December, does it ever register on these year-end lists? Because people, especially in the media, they've made their year-end lists before they leave for the holiday, which is like 2 weeks at the end of December. So we're in right now this sort of weird period of limbo or a void where if something notable happens, then it somehow never counts on these lists for major events in the year 2024 or in preceding years. And likewise, because I've been asked to make these lists at times, and I did one uh, earlier this month. And I'm not so pedantic that I would refuse to participate in the making of the list because, hey, we can't be 100% consistent in all our endeavors here. But likewise, I do find that if something, say, happened last January or February or even March, perhaps April, you'll kind of find that it's very much less likely to make it to these year end lists. Because understandably, people have a recency bias. And because the whole kind of construct of devising events or divvying up events into the range of one calendar year is a bit arbitrary. Now, I'm not so annoying or obnoxious that I'm going to chide anybody who wants to categorize or sort things in accordance with the calendar year that they took place in. I'm just noting, because I'm pedantic, that in practice, what happens is the quote unquote year for these purposes starts in maybe like April or May. And then the hot zone for when events that are most likely to be elevated into this pantheon of notable annual events, that really like kicks into high gear in like September. And then you have this weird like no man's land period in the second half of December where nothing is eligible for the year end list because they've already been made. So, anyway, maybe that's just a pointless hang up I have. I would freely acknowledge that. Um, but I did so, I'm now going to totally flout all of what I just said and bring up a a little blurb that I wrote for Newsweek that was published like a week or two ago, week and a half ago. And so the prompt I was given, and I've done a bunch of these blurb things that Newsweek has people do, or has its contributors and writers do, including myself. And they wanted to give a moment that defined 2024. Now, apparently, Newsweek does a lot of these blurbs because they do really well in terms of traffic. I don't know why exactly. I guess people enjoy these sorts of lists more than they enjoy like regular articles for whatever reason. I don't know. Maybe it's because they're easier to read for certain people because they're in like truncated segments. Like I wrote a blurb here. It's like a paragraph, right? So that's as much as they wanted. And I don't know, they seem to do well. So I've done a bunch of them. And so the moment that I identified as the moment that defined 2024, which is like never a phrasing that I would ever use earnestly. Like it almost sounds like a lyric to a song. The moment that defined 2024. Like I would never actually earnestly say that unless I was singing some schmaltzy ballad, and even then I might be embarrassed. But because I'm more focused, I guess you could say, on the universe of potential political events, I chose Biden pulling out. I mean, that was a moment that I remember very vividly. I remember exactly where I was. I was driving home from the Republican convention. My companion in the seat told me about it, so we kind of pulled over and to a rest stop and evaluated what was going on because it had some impact, like I guess on like what our coverage plans might be. So that was like a genuine moment that did stick out to me as notable. And I'll admit, and maybe I should have mentioned this in the things that I got quote unquote wrong, which I'll get to in a little bit. Um, I did admit that for a while I was a little bit more bearish on the odds of Biden withdrawing than a lot of people. Because for one thing, as I said many times, including on streams here, um, Biden had already acquired all the requisite delegates he needed in order to get the nomination, and there was no real precedent in modern history, anyway, for a presidential nominee who has acquired the requisite delegates, and Biden got like 99+% of them to withdraw. And so it really would have had to been an unprecedented insider style putsch, PUTSCH, for Biden to withdraw. And sure enough, that's what happened. So I was a bit more surprised than I ought to have been. And I think the full story of that whole episode probably needs to be better elucidated, and I'm sure will in due course. A lot of that was driven by, I think, a totally unwarranted assumption in elite Democratic circles, donor circles, certain media circles that Kamala Harris was obviously a better candidate than Biden. I know that seems like conventional wisdom to everyone, but I'm still not sold on that being the case. Because, like it or not, like him or not, whatever you want to say about Biden, he did at least demonstrate some proficiency in electoral politics, with, in particular, his win in the 2020 Democratic primaries. And, having muscled everybody out from a competitive primary in 2024 using his incumbency advantage. That doesn't mean that he was the optimal candidate or the best of all possible candidates in these circumstances, but I did find it to be not to be taken as a given that Kamala Harris would automatically perform better than him just because she was younger, just because he had a terrible debate. Because I had a hunch that this impression of her being sprung upon the public or foisted upon the public would engender suspicion as to her genesis as a candidate or her credibility as a candidate. Whereas with Biden, that wouldn't have been in the case, but the Democrats decided to forfeit their incumbency advantage, which isn't always a strength or isn't always an advantage. Could be maybe sometimes a disadvantage, but is an advantage often enough that if I were advising the Democrats, which I'm not and don't care to be, I might have advised them to, even if the circumstances look somewhat dire, cling to the possibility that there could be an incumbency advantage. So anyway, so Biden withdrawing was the moment that I picked here.